How does it sit? Okay, I think it's right at 6 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good to welcome everybody to City Hall. My name is Andrew Parker. I see a few familiar faces from the last meeting, so apologize if some of this is going to be somewhat repetitive, but we're going to go over the same presentation that we went over last week for the benefit of those that were not here. In addition to that, we're broadcasting live on YouTube, so some residents may be participating there as well. Thank you for coming out tonight again on such an important topic for the city and for your neighborhood, which is stormwater. As I said last week, we're reminded on nights like that particular night and then all the additional days of rain we've received since then, how important of a topic that this is for the city and for your communities. What I told the group last week is that I want the city to know, and you've probably seen some articles in the newspaper, that it has prioritized stormwater management to try to put forward a 21st century plan as we develop into the future. And so I shared with that group that funding's been allocated for several stormwater projects throughout the community. We're going to talk about some of those tonight. Grant submittals have been made. Unfortunately, we found out yesterday we had made 4 submittals to ARPA funds, which we'll talk about tonight, that the city did not receive funding for. We didn't know that last week, but I just want to let you know that this is not one of them, fortunately. So there's already some existing funding available for part of the project. We're doing proactive drainage studies and we're ready to take the next steps. We're ready to go from a planning stage to actually starting to implement some of these projects. I told the group last week, Dalton has been established since 1847. It didn't have a stormwater management ordinance as required by law until 2006. So that basically means that there was 150 years of development without really an insight from a policy perspective about how we're going to manage stormwater. So that presents a unique challenge to those of us today that are directed and charged with maintaining it on a daily basis. So to help us establish a 21st century plan to do that, I was the former public works director before I moved into my current position. And so we scoured the state and the Southeast to select an engineering firm to help us partner. We needed subject matter experts to help us come in, look at the city as a whole, take all the feedback we were getting from property owners and the internal knowledge that our staff has about roadway flooding and develop a plan. And we're actively doing that as we speak. We talked to cities throughout Georgia. As I said, the city of Dalton, due to its population, was not required to have that ordinance until 2006, but a lot of the urban areas across the United States, including a lot of Metro Atlanta, was required to comply with these rules 10 years before that. So several cities in Georgia had stormwater programs and had stormwater utilities. You probably heard of those across the state. So we called them and said, how are you dealing with these challenges? And ultimately we landed on the firm Arcadis, and several members of their team are here tonight. They're one of the foremost engineering consultants, not just in stormwater, but around the nation. They're an international firm, but specifically here in Georgia, they've got expertise helping cities develop plans to dig out of some of these long-standing infrastructure challenges. The goal was to help us develop a strategy and an actionable plan to tackle these decade-long problems. So tonight we're going to share updates on how we arrived at today from a policy perspective. What we think it's important for the neighborhood to understand. Just a couple of years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation based on the rules that governed where our public works team is allowed to do maintenance. So we're going to give you an update on that. Talk about some of the citywide initiatives, some of the projects we've been working on throughout the city. And then most importantly, as to why you're here, the study efforts in your drainage basin, which we call Walnut North. That's just a term that we've used internally to talk about the drainage path that originates sort of up in the cemetery, West Hill Cemetery. It follows Ridge Street to West Franklin Street, or excuse me, I skipped McFarland Avenue to West Franklin Street, and then down to Valley Drive, ultimately discharging at a culvert under Walnut Avenue and into McCarty subdivision. Just a couple of housekeeping items for those of you who weren't here last time. If you need to get up and use the restroom, they're on the right. Feel free to do that at any time. We do have a sign-in sheet as well. If you don't mind to sign that, that way we've got your phone number and address and everything. We know who was here. We ask that you save questions till the end because we've got a lot of material to cover, and I think we'll be able to get through it a little bit quicker and then give you time at the end to ask as many questions as you want. We'll stay after if you have a specific question about your property that we didn't address or feedback that you think we need to have to incorporate in the plan. We got a lot of that last week and it was very helpful. And then, as I said, since this is a complex topic, if there's something that we can't answer tonight, our engineers are going to review that and we'll get back to you with an answer if we can't answer it tonight. Our next thing is to, if you'll skip forward to the project team, I want to introduce our project team. As I said, I'm Andrew Parker. I'm the city administrator, former public works director. So stormwater's a very near and dear topic to me. Our new public works director, Chad Townsend, is here. He's only been on the job 3 weeks, but he's understood very quickly. We've had some emergency stormwater repairs that we're working on just in that 3 weeks in the city to keep a road from collapsing. So Chad already understands, I think, the nature of what we're working on. Jackson Shepard is our public works project engineer. He's been appointed as the point person for the city related to carrying this planning effort forward related to stormwater on a citywide basis, but also for this particular project. He's the city's point person for the project management. On the Arcata side, Rich Gruhl is here. Rich is a renowned expert in the state of Georgia. You talk to anybody around the state related to municipal stormwater, and Rich's name will get brought up just because he's helped a lot of these cities where they've had very similar issues. Alex Carlson was the chief modeler, the drainage modeler on this project. He was here last week. He had a medical emergency and was not able to be here tonight, or a medical emergency. He gave a lot of insight into the model last week. If you were here, if you want to hear his presentation, Rich is going to go over it tonight, but the video is on YouTube. If you want to hear any specific part of the modeling or whatever, that's available on our city YouTube account. Taylor Tittle, if you don't care. Taylor's one of the engineers out of Chattanooga. He's involved on the design side. He's actually working on some of the plans within West Hill Cemetery that are almost complete. Madison Smith is here from Chattanooga office on the design side as well. A couple other folks that have been involved in this project that aren't here tonight because they're out of state is Chris Solden. He was a technical advisor on the project, and Mike Devano, who has been on site several times. He's in Philadelphia, but Mike is actually working on some urban stormwater planning for some of the most developed cities in the nation, Washington, D.C., New York City, where their problems are compounded. But what he's been able to do is translate those solutions to our scale here in Dalton, and also present concepts to us that Georgia has not seen yet, that are, states that are more progressive in terms of implementing some green infrastructure strategies to really help with flooding and runoff. That the state of Georgia has just not made it here yet. They're bringing those techniques actually on this project in some aspects. So with that, what I'll do is turn it over to Rich to give an overview of the policy. Jackson Shepard from our city team is going to go over some of the projects that we're working on, and then Rich will come back up and talk about the Walnut North neighborhood. Again, we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. So this is going to kind of bring you to how we got from what has been historically the program to today that actually resulted in us working on this project. Okay. One of the biggest changes that we've seen in the program in the last 20 years is the extent of service policy update. The extent of service is a fancy way of saying where the city works, where they'll do work on infrastructure, be that a road or a pipe or what have you. But like I said, bottom line is just what is the city responsible for? Historically, Dalton and pretty much every other community in Georgia has only looked at public property. So think city hall, parks, whatever, and then public rights of way. So the streets, the city owned streets, that has historically been the purview of their work. They did not go off of right of way. They didn't go off public property. They just work exclusively on the roads. In January of last year, Dalton updated their extended service policy. They kind of kept the historic extended service policy where they say, okay, we're still responsible for the roads, we're still responsible for the public properties. But they added a caveat to that, a little star, that they will determine where the public or the taxpayers, in other words, you guys, where your money would be spent working on infrastructure, either building it or maintaining it on off right of way situations, on private property. So there's a policy now of where they think that the public should have an investment in infrastructure that's not on public property. And I realize there's a lot of words here. I took this, actually, this is kind of a précis of what the actual policy is, but they will work off right away on drainage systems if the system is connected directly to the city's existing system. So think about this, just in your mind, think about a couple inlets on a road. You got a pipe between them. The pipe comes out one side, goes off the right of way and dumps water out into a ditch or something like that. It didn't seem fair that the private property owner should be responsible for that last 20 feet of pipe. And so there's a clear case to be made for that part of the system is actually part of the public system, and therefore they should take that on under certain conditions. Another factor they look at is if there's a significant amount of stormwater runoff conveyed by the drainage system that's generated by city-owned property or city right-of-way. So in the case of Walnut North, you think about if you're living just south of Emory Street, there's 50 acres of drainage, I think is what the number is, 50 acres of drainage coming down off the city cemetery, city-owned property, public property, and off Emory Street, and then goes into private drainage systems. So there's a case to be made that the bulk of that water is coming from city property or city-owned right-of-way. And then there's also a case to be made that in select situations, the failure of a drainage system result in a significant threat to the public and or adjacent property. So just kind of a catch-all of, like, okay, if this pipe collapses, 50 homes is on this area, like 50 homes may get flooded. Like that would be a case of where, okay, there's probably a public benefit to maintaining that infrastructure with taxpayer money. So those are the kind of the three cases that we will look at off right-of-way property. Now remember, everything on the street is still the city's responsibility. It's just where will we consider going off right-of-way. If we're in one of those cases, they may accept the drainage system for operations and maintenance or improvement if it meets certain eligibility criteria. And that is, the drainage system has not been damaged due to negligence of property. In other words, if let's say I had a pipe on my property and I got out there with a track hoe and I started goofing off and I destroyed the public, this drainage system, and then say, hey, y'all need to come out and fix this pipe on my property because it's taking water from the city road, and I destroyed it with playing around. Like that would not be a case where it would be on you as a taxpayer to be responsible for that damage. And the other one is, while we're saying we're going off right away, there needs to be an easement. Like there needs to be a defined area said, okay, this is the area that the public is going to be responsible for. And so that easement program, like we're not going to come on the property if you say we can't come on the property. One too many. Where the city will not accept a drainage system. Even if it's located on a non-residential property, and what I mean by non-residential is really commercial, we're not going to go fix Walmart's pipes for them. They've got plenty of money coming in. They can fix their own pipes on private property in a commercial setting. And then the other situation that the city feels like it's just too great a risk is if a pipe goes under an existing building. There's a lot of risk when you start messing with pipes that are under buildings that you could damage the building doing that. So that's kind of one of those situations where it's like, okay, this is getting to an unacceptable risk level. But prior to accepting the drainage easement, if you are in one of the situations where it's like, okay, we can do work off right away in this area, the public works director will prepare and provide the city council a corrective action plan to address known deficiencies with the drainage system. So why that's important. Let's say you got a pipe on your property. Chad, who's the public works director, he can't accept an easement from you. Like that's not his job. That's outside the city council, the guys that sit up here. The folks up here, they're the ones that are going to accept it on behalf of the city. They're going to positively say, we will accept this drainage system and expend public monies on it. It can't be some deal that somebody works out with Chad or, Jackson or even Andrew. Like this is beyond their pay grade. And so what they need to do prior to bringing that easement to the council is say, okay, we're bringing this easement. This is the drainage system. We're proposing to take it inside our extent of service area. And here's the corrective action. This is what we need to do to fix it so that the council can be very informed about what's going to be taken on as responsibility so they can make an informed decision about this. Following acceptance of the easement, the corrective action plan be included in a list of capital projects. There's projects all over, and you'll hear about some of them all over town that got work that needs to be done. So that will get put into that list, and then it'll be prioritized appropriately. So just because, let's just say, I know Mr. Snyder back there, just because we took got an easement from Jackson, we're not going to suddenly bump his project down a notch just because somebody else jumped the line. It'll be put into that list and looked at appropriately. So let's talk about that list, the capital improvement program. CIP, sometimes you guys will hear that term CIP bandied around. That's what we're talking about here. Currently, we're cataloging and prioritizing known stormwater needs. The last time I looked, there was over 40 projects on the list of issues that need to be looked at. A lot of the project types, we're talking about flooding of homes, flooding of buildings. We're talking about stream degradation that's resulting in potential property damage. We're talking about failing infrastructure. We've got a lot of pipes. We've got an inventory. Literally, the city has a map of all the drainage pipes on all the public property, rights of way, and things like that. I forget, there's thousands. I want to say there are like 10,000 assets in that database. Of those, we've got quite a few, what we call tier 1A assets. These are pipes that go under a road that if that pipe fails, there's no way for the residents to get out. Like it's a one-way in, one-way out neighborhood. That pipe collapses, they can't get out. Emergency services can't get in. These are high risk assets, and quite a few of them. I don't remember the exact number, but 3,000 linear feet of those are corrugated metal pipes with about a 25-year life expectancy. And so Jackson here actually went out and looked at every single one of them, and those are being put into the list as well for rehabilitation. And then finally, we're looking at stormwater management infrastructure, things that can be done to reduce flooding. We'll talk a little bit about some of those as part of this project. And then finally, we're going to take that and we're going to prioritize it based on certain factors like infrastructure criticality, which is, again, kind of think about that tier 1A. There's actually quite a few different tiers. Depends on what the risk factors are. We're looking at EOS status. Is it public? Is it private? Is it even a project that would be inside the EOS policy? And then finally, flooding severity, structural flooding, nuisance flooding, how often does it flood? Things of that nature are going to go into play along with other factors. So that's kind of the CIP program as it currently stands. It's still in a state of development. Jackson's kind of taking lead on that. We're providing the muscle for him, but he's going through and looking at all those right now and trying to help fill in the data gaps so that we can get that updated. So that all goes into how we got to today. So we got flooding problems on private property that are within the extent of service, the policy. We got houses flooding with a significant amount of water coming from public property. And that's how we got to kind of today. But before we jump onto the Walnut North project, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the recent efforts, current efforts that so you guys can see what we're talking about. Jackson's going to come up and talk about that right now.
So what I'm going to go through is some of our recent completed projects, as well as our current efforts throughout the city. Just a brief overview. Starting with Covey Ridge, this is a completed project. This particular location resides within the Mill Creek watershed. This particular location has experienced historical residential flooding as well as structural flooding and street flooding. And so what the city has done is developed on implemented a detention pond on undeveloped property to provide meaningful flow attenuation to reduce the flooding risks and hazards within this drainage area. Next one is Brookwood Flood Storage Project. This was a recently completed project as well. This particular location is vulnerable to flooding. It's this particular property where we implement a flood storage area is residing within a 100-year floodplain. And how we accomplished this was under voluntary participation with the property owner. The city purchased the property and removed the impervious surface, displacing water within this drainage basin, and provided a flood staging area prior to entering state waters. This is a prime example of a floodplain restoration project. We're hoping to do similar floodplain restoration projects, not necessarily from existing properties, but we're looking to identify similar situations like this citywide. Next one is Prater Alley Drainage Basin Study. This is one that Arcadis has been working on for quite a while now. This is a particular location where there's historical flooding, structural flooding hazards. And what the city is looking to do is to implement an underground detention system upstream of these issues, to provide meaningful flow attenuation and reduce the flooding hazards. Next one is the Glenwood Avenue Flood Mitigation Project. This is a particular location as well has structural hazards, flooding hazards, as well as the existing infrastructure on city right-of-way is not conducive for handling intense storm events. We're talking 50 and up, or actually even 25 years storm events. McClellan Creek Drainage Evaluation. So this is another thing Arcadis is working on, which is part of our flood abatement plan, where they're taking LiDAR data from USGS and identifying locations where flood mitigation and flow attenuation green infrastructure can be implemented. This particular visual is a location where we've submitted ARPA grant for, which is something I'll get to in just a second. But basically, this is a prime example of properties located within a 100-year floodplain and looking to implement some sort of green infrastructure to provide relief within this drainage area. Next we'll go to is grants. So this is an example of this is one that we've recently applied for and unfortunately did not get any awarded grant funding for, is the ARPA grant, which is goes through the state. For 4 projects we try to get additional money for was Prater Alley, Glenwood Avenue, McClellan Creek, that particular project shown before this slide, as well as a culvert rehab where critical infrastructure needs to be restored. These are also ARPA funding is a prime example. There are other funding options out there, and we're fully looking to pursue anything we can to acquire state and federal help on top of anything from SPLOST funds. So this is something we're hoping to seek out on an annual basis. Walnut North. So now we get to the Walnut North Drainage Basin. So this is a exact same situation to the other projects completed and our ongoing efforts, where you have residential flooding hazards as well as structural flooding. It's sort of a common theme amongst all these and why these have been prioritized and brought to the top of the list. And in summary, this is just gives you a good overview of all of our ongoing efforts. This is a citywide effort, and we're trying to tackle as much as we possibly can, and as efficiently, as quickly as we can, because I know there are flooding hazards throughout the city, and it is our priority to do so. And from here, I'll pass it back to Rich.
While I was sitting there listening to Jackson, I just want to add 2 things to what he just said about the grants. Maybe a question that's floating out there is, why didn't we apply for grant funding for y'all's work? I actually asked Andrew that a while back, and it was still, we didn't slow everything down. Anytime you get federal grant funding, everything slows way down and there's a lot more paperwork. And so the city, Andrew and the city council felt like we need to keep this thing moving. So that's why that was not on that list. And the other thing is, I think, again, there's a lot of projects, and as you saw, a lot of the factors there was we were looking at where are their homes flooding, where are their buildings flooding. So that's been kind of the thing. And then the last thing, I guess, three things I would note is the ones that are done, those were the easy ones. Those were the ones where there was a real obvious solution that didn't require a lot of coordination with property owners, because the people that were affected just said, okay, we can do this. And it was relatively small projects. So Walnut North is neither simple nor small. So anyway, the drainage basin is significant. There's two basic branches. One starts up in the cemetery and drains down to, let me back up one thing. Again, I apologize. Alex is the modeler. So if y'all were here last time, he's the expert. I'm just going to try to do as best facsimile as I can of what he does. So hopefully I'll make him proud. Anyway, this is a drainage basin. As you can see, it's a lot of drainage coming down from the north from the cemetery, and then drains down through y'all's properties for those of you who live in the area. I forget the exact drainage area, but I know there's this kind of polygon, if you will, of the upper left-hand one. That's about 50 acres to give you some scale. So it's hundreds of acres of drainage coming down to the channel at Walnut. So let's talk a little bit about when we were turned loose on this, which was last, I believe it was last spring or summer. We were told to start working on this. The primary drainage path that we were told to study was from the West Hill Cemetery down to Walnut Avenue. That's because we knew that's where a lot of the drainage complaints that the city had received were located. We need to create a computer model of sufficient detail, which wound up being quite complex, to test improvement scenarios. In other words, we tried to build a model that replicated what you guys were seeing out there in the real world, so that when we started putting in ideas, we could say, okay, does this make things better? Does this make things worse? Make sure that whatever we're doing is creating a benefit to the community. Improvement goals, our primary improvement goals were to reduce structural flooding, in other words, home flooding, identify improvements that could manage the runoff better, and then extend the infrastructure life expectancy that's out there. Primary constraining parameters was identify solutions that do not transfer the problem. In other words, don't fix one problem, make another problem worse. Work within the current extent of service policy, those factors that we talked about earlier, and then work to achieve a 100-year solution for structural flooding areas. In other words, we want to significantly reduce the frequency of flooding inside homes. This is a table just to kind of give you guys, I know I throw terms like 100-year, 5-year level of service around. 100-year storm is really kind of a misnomer. The idea is there's a 1% chance any given year that you're going to see that storm event. So the example that I always give is like, think about if you're like playing a game at home that's got dice. You got a 6-sided dice, 1 through 6, and you throw that dice. There's a 1 in 6 chance you're going to see a 6 on that throw. That doesn't mean that if you throw it again, you can't see another 6. It just means every time you throw it, there's a 1 in 6 chance you can see that 6 on that throw. So that's when we say return frequency in years. We're really talking about there's about a 1 in 100 chance that you're going to see that any given year. For storm depth, just to give you an idea of what that means, a 1-year storm event is about 3.2 inches of rain in 24 hours in this area. 100-year is almost 7.7 inches. To give you some real world comparison, for those of you who remember the storm that happened in April of 2020, that was about 6 inches of rain. So it probably corresponded somewhere in the 25-year. That was not a 100-year event. The one that happened in March of last year was about 3.7. So it was about 2-year storm event. So when we say 100-year, we're talking about significant amounts of rainwater coming down and turning into runoff. So as I mentioned, Alex built this model of the existing conditions, and then he started testing scenarios, things that we thought might be feasible to implement that could maybe make things better. So he wound up testing, at the end of the day, 5 different scenarios. The first scenario was to replace the existing storm pipes along kind of adjacent to Ridge Street, if you will, coming down from the cemetery, which is in the north, the upper end of this photograph. Coming down, just replace all those pipes. In other words, if there's flooding because there's just not a pipe capacity, let's just make the pipes bigger. So what he did was he tested that, and in this table, I realize it's kind of busy. What I want you to look at is on the left, you can see points along the drainage basin. Anytime you see a green number, so like you see 614 Ridge Street, you see how that number says it was a 5-year storm event that could pass, then it went up to 100. That means we significantly increased the capacity of those pipes in this testing scenario, so we could get that 100-year. But the flow rates, which are all the numbers to the right of that, you see existing and then proposed for different storm events. And you can see anytime you see a red number, that means we transferred the problem downstream. So we fixed the problem at 614, but we made everything downstream worse in this scenario, if this scenario was implemented. So we were testing these scenarios doing that. So we got to the end of scenario A and said, okay, what does this all mean? It means that we provided a 100-year level of service in the Ridge Street area, and we reduced flooding along Ridge Street. The downside is we're going to do a lot of significant work. We're going to be tearing up backyards, working well off the right of way, making life generally miserable for people that live there on those, along those pipes. We also are going to create a long-term maintenance responsibility on private property. So anytime there need to be work, public works crews are going to be back there working on that system. And then again, we transferred the problem, which at the end of the day is really a negative. So we did not feel like scenario A was going to work. Scenario B, Alex started playing around with the idea of, okay, if we don't want to work in the backyards, is there a way we can maybe put in a new pipe that kind of goes around the problem, stays on public right of way, and doesn't cause that big increase in flows? We call this scenario B. A lot of times you'll hear us refer to it as the Ridge Street Storm Pipe Bypass. We're basically moving the water around. We're going to pick it up on Emory Street, move it around the site. Again, you see those green numbers up on Ridge Street. It did a great job of reducing flooding up there. The downside is he couldn't find a solution that didn't transfer the problem down again. It's just a very similar, rather than moving it through here, we just moved it to the right. But we couldn't find a solution that didn't transfer flooding downstream to downstream neighbors. So again, we liked that it provided 100-year level service. We liked that it reduced the flooding along those areas. We liked the fact that most of the work was going to be on public right of way, but again, unacceptable solution because it transferred the flooding. We're like, okay, we can't just pipe it around. What if we, rather than trying to just move the water, what if we made it less? We reduce the amount of water coming down that hill. And that's what improvement scenario C is. You'll hear us refer to as the West Hill Cemetery improvements. What we were going to do is those blue areas. So this is that's Emory Street kind of running left to right down at the bottom of the slide. And to the north, you see two blue areas. Those are existing, one of them is an existing detention pond, another one's an existing ditch. We're going to dig those out and we're going to make it so that water can stack up in those holding areas and release it more slowly downstream. The green area to the north of that is what's called a regenerative stormwater conveyance. There's a ditch. You guys can go out there and tomorrow if you want. You can see all of this. There's a riprap line ditch where that green area is. Water comes down off the hill. It's going pretty fast. What we're proposing to do in this scenario is to build a series of small holding basins, if you will, and let them fill up one after another, after another, after another. Hold them there and reduce the amount of water that goes downstream and just release it very slowly in combination with these detention ponds. So the idea there is the amount of water that's leaving Emory Street and heading off right away is going to be significantly reduced from a flow standpoint. So what I'd like you to take from here is you will notice that there's a lot more green on the left there. That means that we're seeing improvements in almost all of the locations we modeled. Everything, we're going to see flows go down in every one of those cases. The other thing you're going to see is there's no red numbers on the right. So we're not transferring problems. We're actually making it better. Now, that being said, what we found in this scenario was it only provided some improvement to the existing infrastructure. So as I mentioned earlier, when we started this, was we're trying to go to a 100-year level of service. We don't want homes to flood up to and including the 100-year storm event. Like, we shouldn't see water going into like Mr. Snyder's house or downstream along West Franklin. We don't want to see flooding there. And this definitely makes it better, but it doesn't get anywhere near that level of service we were looking to achieve with this program. And again, we like the fact that most of the work was on public right of way. So we're not tearing up private property doing this. Again, the major challenge here is it just doesn't, it gets us some of the way, but not there where we need to be. So after that, Alex started saying, okay, what if I take a little piece of this, a little piece of that, and a little piece of this over here, and we start putting things together? He said, well, we like that the Ridge Street bypass system in scenario B, we like the fact that it solved the flooding problem. We liked that it was on public property for the most part. What we didn't like was the transfer problem. So what if we took all that work in the cemetery combined with the Ridge Street bypass system? What does that do to us? As you can see, similar to what we saw in scenario C, we get improvements all along the waterway, including 100-year level of service along Ridge Street. Those homes along Ridge Street would see 100-year level of service in those existing drainage areas. And we're not transferring the problem. So that's when we started kind of getting hope. So again, the advantages here is we achieved the goals of the program of reducing structural flooding adjacent to Ridge Street. We didn't transfer anything downstream, so we didn't have to worry about folks along West Franklin getting flooded. It did provide some improvement to the existing downstream infrastructure performance. So we didn't solve the flooding problem down there, but we definitely were going to make it a little bit better. And again, most of the work was on public right of way. So that's how we got to scenario E, which is kind of all of that, plus some improvements along West Franklin Street, a little bit along McFarland, and then all the way down to Valley Drive by adding some improvements there. So this is kind of the conglomeration of all of them. Again, lots of green on the left. We're getting great performance, especially where we were having homes flood, and we're getting no transfer problem downstream. So this was kind of where we're like, okay, we think we've got it. There really were lots of great advantages that we just talked about. The only downside was this is a significant improvement or significant investment by the public, by the taxpayer to address these things. So that is not I hate to say this, but that's not an engineering problem. That's a public works director, city administrator problem to go find the money. So that's where we ended the study. So let me walk you through real quick. A typical engineering project has multiple phases. Alex didn't really touch on this last time, but there's usually a study phase that results in a concept. Like we say, okay, we think this will address the problem, which is what Alex came up with. Then we go into an engineering design phase, which has multiple steps. We go into what sometimes you'll hear us say 30% design. I don't want you guys to think that we only did 30% of the work. The 30% design is we took Alex's concept and I gave it to Taylor here, who's a civil engineer who does actual construction plans, and say, Taylor, Alex came up with this great idea. Now go make it work on the real world. And then he sits there and struggles and he says, okay, I got to deal with these utilities. I got to deal with these driveways. I got to make sure these residents can get in and out of their homes. He takes that concept and turns it into a real world working plan. That's usually only a few pages long, but it's kind of, think of it as proof of concept. After we get through that proof of concept and say, this is a real deal, we could go out and build this. The next phase is you'll hear us refer to 60% set of plans. Again, that's not 60% of the work. That's just kind of where we take it to that phase where like, okay, these are real construction plans. There's a set here somewhere of a set of 60% plans. You could go out and build it, but it's kind of that last phase where we're like, okay, here are the plans. Here's how we're going to build it. After you get to this phase, there should only be a handful of details that really aren't related to design. They're more like, how are we going to do restoration? How are we going to do sediment containment, things like that, traffic control. After that, you go to 90%. 90%, you're just sending it to the permitting agencies, whoever those are. Could be the Corps of Engineers, could be FEMA, could be the local permitting requirements. That's what the purpose of that is. And then after that, you go to 100% which are issued for construction. So that's kind of the life cycle of just about any engineering project. We go from a concept, which is what we just looked at. That was the concept. Then we go into design. The devil is in the details in the design. And that's where Taylor earns his money, is he's got to take all these crazy ideas that me and Alex come up with and turn them into actual real world projects. So the current effort is to work on some of that flood attenuation up in the West Hill Cemetery. Again, remember, one thing that we can't do above anything is transfer that problem. So the purpose of the West Hill Cemetery improvements is to make sure that we're not going to transfer that problem. We can start doing all the other things after that. But one thing we don't want to do is make flooding worse. And so West Hill Cemetery, we're going to do that regenerative stormwater conveyance. That was that green area I referred to earlier. We're going to expand those basins and ditches. We're going to install some outlet control structures so we can better meter out that flow downstream. We're going to work in the design works in conjunction with some downstream lining, potential lining of metal culverts. And then again, the overall goal is to slow and detain water from those 50-acre drainage basins so that we can do the other things that are really going to move that needle. Just to give you an example, I realize stormwater regenerative stormwater conveyance doesn't mean a lot to most folks. The picture on the right, that's that riprap line ditch. And like I said, you guys can drive up there tomorrow in the daylight. You can see that. The image on the left is an example of an RSC, or a regenerative stormwater conveyance. And you can see that ditch was kind of similar in that it just let water run through it. But everywhere you see those pools, they're designed to fill up with water as it rains, hold it in place, and then let it go downstream. So that's an example of one that Arcadis designed up in Virginia. And I don't think we've got very many of these in Georgia. It's kind of a new thing up down here. It just hadn't caught on yet. It wound up in a state design manual 5 years or so ago. And we're starting to see people talk about them. They just hadn't caught on real big with like development yet. These are those green areas, or not the green areas, the blue areas I was showing you earlier, the detention ponds that I was referring to. If you guys have been up to West Hill Cemetery and you've seen those low areas and you see these weird lines of rocks going through them, those are those areas that we're talking about. So what we're going to do is we're going to dig those out, make them a little bit deeper, wider, and make it so that they can grab that stormwater before it goes under Emory Street and store it temporarily and let it out slow. The purpose, again, is to reduce peak flows, release downstream, make sure that we can start putting in more efficient conveyances downstream along Ridge Street and other places. We'll increase the level of service downstream just by doing this. Not that we're going to solve the problem. I don't want you guys to think we're going to solve the problem just with this project, but we're going to definitely kind of move the needle enough so that we can do the other things. So for example, at Ridge Street, we're talking about in some cases going from a 1-year level of service up to a 10-year level of service. So we're going to see some reduction in flows there. Same at McFarland Avenue. Again, we're going to see some minor adjustments so that we can put in these other things. And again, I just want to emphasize, this is step one. This is not the final solution. This is we're creating the conditions so that we can do the other things. You can kind of see that a little bit. This is Alex, and this really gets into what Alex does. This is the flows at 612 Ridge Street. So along the channel, kind of running parallel to Ridge Street, you can see that the existing flows will be roughly cut in half for a 10-year flow. So again, I don't want to imply that there's not going to be any water coming down a hill, but it's going to be less during the same storm event. One of the things that Alex modeled is what he's trying to show here is one of the concerns we had was want to know if we could run all the water above Emory Street in a detention pond. Some of it goes into the cemetery, some of it goes immediately downstream. I asked him to take a look at that and say, can we do that without making things worse? And what he found out was we could put it in there, but we're going to reduce the amount of benefit we get. So given that this is a short-term project as far as building this and then building the bypass system, which is going to solve the problem, we felt like, okay, I'd rather get that benefit, short-term benefit for the next year or two or whatever that winds up being, and do that. This is another hydrograph. So you think about we put all this stuff in the cemetery, we're obviously going to see some benefits down there at Emery Street and just below it. But even if you get down as far as, say, Ridge Street, right above West Franklin, we're still going to see some benefits from that. And so this is what gave us the confidence that we can put in some of these other systems. Again, this is an example of how we're going to, again, do some of these improvements just by putting in the detention at the cemetery at McFarland. Long term, I know one of the residents here along McFarland had a question about, is this really going to make differences on my property where it's an open channel? And what we found was, once all this gets put in, we're going to see a foot reduction in a 10-year storm event. So whereas it may have gotten out of the bank before, now it'll stay in the channel and it won't flood the adjacent properties. All right, so that's kind of where we're at now. We're at a 60% design phase. Jackson has the plans for the cemetery improvements. He's going through those, looking at those, just making sure that it's going to check all the boxes for the city. We'll do, I think we've got, is that next week? We got the 60% design review for the cemetery. We'll check off on that and then we'll go to 90% for permitting. And then shortly after that, and there's very limited permitting. The only person that's got to look at it is the county drainage engineer who issues the land disturbance permit here in the city. Once he signs off on that, then we'll have a set of plans that are ready to go to construction, and we'll turn that over to the public works guys for bidding. But moving forward, we've still got to do plans for that Ridge Street bypass, that whole area between Emery Street and, say, McFarland. We've still got to take that from Alex's model, turn that into a set of construction plans. So we got to look at all the drainage is coming down Ridge Street, all the drainage is coming down through those pipes, look at all those factors and kind of turn that into a set of actual construction plans. And then the second, so take that's that concept, that Ridge Street bypass, take that picture and turn it into a full-blown set of construction plans along with all the other improvements that will go along with that. And we're still working on some of those factors. Then another phase will be looking at those West Franklin Street improvements, building a parallel drainage system to the existing one. They'll take water again coming down from Ridge, coming down along parallel to McFarland. Will pick up that drainage with some additional piping in order to reduce structural flooding along there. And then ultimately, the plan is right now, the thinking is to take it down valley and then dump it out into the existing channel behind those homes, downstream of 705 Valley, which also has some structural flooding concerns, and then stabilize the channel along Valley Drive. So that's kind of where we're at. Like I said, there's still a lot of details to work out. Taylor and I and Alex had a discussion earlier this week, I think. It's either last week or earlier this week, and we discussed what all the kind of the data gaps are and what the challenges are going to be and things, more data that we need just to make sure that we can turn these concepts into reality and hopefully get you guys some benefits. So
Thank you, Rich.
hopefully I did Alex proud.
I've got a couple of quick things before we open it up for questions I wanted to share. As Rich mentioned, we've really put a lot of focus on the cemetery improvements because we've got money allocated for at least that phase right now. I mean, it's sitting in a project account. We've been using it. We've had to do actually ground penetrating radar to make sure that there's no graves in some of those older sections where we're talking about making the detention areas wider. A lot of logistical work to lead up to that really tees us up to the next phases that Rich talked about. Also, what was included in phase one, it was a little bit tough to see on the screen. Where these slides, we can email these to you, and I understand from Jorge, our IT director, on the YouTube video, you can view them in high res. You can see it better than what the screen projects. But the plan calls for lining several pipes throughout the basin that are in existence today. So as Rich mentioned earlier, in this part of the world, North Georgia, those corrugated metal pipes, we see an average lifespan of 25 to 30 years. Many of you may remember last March, we had one fail on Rocky Face Estate subdivision. It was a 72-inch pipe that collapsed at the basically the right of way and private property connection. That was our first sort of venture into this new extent of service policy because we had to run a new pipe system down to the tributary. That was a project that cost the city about $120,000. It could have been prevented for maybe $10,000 or $12,000 using techniques that are available to the industry today that weren't available 5-10 years ago. So when we say lining, Rich, do you care just to explain what that means for the group? And then I'll go over a couple of these points and then we'll turn it over for questions.
So a liner is, in the case of what we're talking about, it's a concrete product. I know, sorry. Used to talking virtually like that. It's a concrete product that is sprayed, and there's a little sled machine that gets pulled through, and concrete grout gets pumped to this sled as they pull it through the pipe, and a little spinning head sprays this grout onto the interior of the pipe and puts it down in very thin lifts, pulled through, and then eventually the idea is you build up this what is essentially a liner, concrete liner inside this pipe. Now it's only about half inch thick, and while I say it's grout, it's really it's some chemist came up with it. Normal concrete, like the stuff we would buy to do our driveways or sidewalks or whatever, is about 3,000 psi concrete. That's what you see mostly around here. This stuff is 8,000 psi. It has no rock in it. It's incredibly strong, tough. And the beauty is when they line it, it actually creates a smooth interior to this pipe and actually makes the pipe more efficient. Because if you think about water going through a corrugated metal pipe, it's bouncing along all those little ridges. When they spray this in, it kind of fills in those dips in the pipe and actually creates a smooth interior. So it actually gets a little more efficient hydraulically. And the other nice thing is the corrugated metal pipe can completely rust away because you built basically a pipe in a pipe. And that stuff supposedly is going to have like a 50-year life expectancy. So it's a great technology. We like it for roads, like culverts that go under roads. We like that because we can go through, pull that sled through. It puts this pipe inside this pipe the whole time you're driving over it. You think about when we dig up a pipe, we got to dig up the road. You're going to have to find another way around while we're working on the project. We got to deal with all the utilities. $100,000 road project, if we do a liner, could be $10,000 or $15,000. So saves time, saves money, and it's better for the residents that live in that area. So
and that's exactly the scenario we had in Rocky Face Estates. Thank goodness, if you're familiar with that subdivision, it's got a second entry. But it had this been on some other streets that we have, those 3,000 linear feet of pipe that Jackson mentioned were tier 1A, we would have had to work day and night to try to restore access for the residents and emergency traffic. So I just say that to say we realize that there's a lot of pipes inside this drainage path from the cemetery down to McCarty subdivision that would benefit from a structural standpoint of going ahead and do the lining if they're metal, from a hydraulic standpoint. But also we recognize structurally, a lot of these pipes have reached the end of their useful life. So we've got to take action now. We need them to remain for this solution E model to work. And so that's the point of why we included that in phase one. In terms of planning development for phase, what we call the bypass, the Ridge Street bypass, the new pipe system that we're talking about on Franklin down through Valley, as Rich kind of alluded to, we go from concept development with the study. We've got to figure out what will work. What is it going to take to fix this, and then actually turn it over to do construction drawings, which is what they mentioned, that we will hire a contractor to come in and actually perform the work. Chad, I didn't mention this in his bio, but Chad comes from a decade-long career in the private industry building the stuff. So he's already, challenging the Arcadis team. How are we going to build this? And Taylor, how are we going to make this happen? And so those conversations are being had. Some of the stream segments downstream of Ridge Street are higher in classification in terms of their state water designation. So they're actually regulated if they're an intermittent or a perennial stream, which once we get down, I think to Valley Drive, it's a perennial stream. So we actually have to go to the state to get permits if we're going to do anything more than doing a pipelining. And so that takes time. There's like 90-day processes built in that. And so that's the beauty of segmenting this project into phases. While we're working on building phase one in the cemetery, we can actively be designing, permitting, getting grants, getting funding for these other phases. I told the group last week, I had a question from the audience, what's the best case scenario on when this whole thing, as you presented to us, will be complete? And I told them, and I asked my staff and team after the meeting if I gave them a heart attack. I said, I want to have this plan executed if we can in 2 years. From this moment, we're about hopefully to get ready to go to bidding on the cemetery work. That's a lofty goal. We've got to get permits. Another key thing that I told the group last week is this plan is ultimately contingent on us receiving easements from the property owner. So this work cannot be done legally on private property without an easement. That's a violation of Georgia's gratuity statute. And so that's why we need those drainage easements, and our staff will be working with you individually on each of your properties because each property is different. Some we don't need easements from. Some of this is in the right of way down on West Franklin Street, some of that on Valley Drive. We don't need any easements. It's in the right of way, but other places we do. And so we'll be coordinating with you directly if you have impact to secure those easements so that we can begin work. The last thing I'll mention, which ties into that, is just from a funding standpoint, we're using SPLOST funding. So there's a good portion of this project's being paid for by the 2015 SPLOST. There was some money allocated in that SPLOST for roads, bridges, and stormwater projects. And also the city's issued debt. The city issued a bond in 2020, and part of the projects that were approved as part of that bond was stormwater, because we realized to execute a lot of these projects that were mentioned and beyond that, just to maintain the assets in city right of way, we've got to have a dedicated revenue stream to be able to start tackling these, especially in light of the fact that we were notified yesterday that Dalton was not one of the cities selected by the state to receive the additional ARPA funding, which we were sorely disappointed about because we put a lot of effort into submitting some competitive packages. As Rich said, we didn't include this one, number one, because we already had a project funding account, which is a key logistical step in getting money allocated to it. And as Rich said, quite frankly, we had 4 or 5 sort of long-standing complaints in this basin. We didn't want any federal strings to slow this project down. We wanted to be able to deliver this as quickly as we could get funding identified and get the plans done. So those are just some sort of closing comments I had, and be glad to turn it over to anybody for questions. We would ask you to speak in the mic because we've got a couple of folks on the internet there that will be also hearing us.
Okay, I'm David Young, 614 Ridge. Now, my question is, all the charts with the flows and the improvements, that was based on rainfall only in the cemetery. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct. It includes all the drainage all the way down to Walnut. So as you move down the system, so we start with the cemetery, and then as you move down at strategic points, we add the flow in between those two points.
Starting in the cemetery.
Started in the cemetery, but
I'm getting as much water from the west as I'm getting from the cemetery. It comes in and joins on my property between mine and Steve's property. So if that water is not in those numbers,
it's in there. But I can assure you it's in there.
Because that.
Yeah, it is. That's no. Let me go back a lot. Oh, there it is. So
if you see, can you use the laser point? Let me operate it there. Laser. All right, so right there, that highlighted parcel is 612 Ridge Street. So this blue line represents think that's a little over 10 acres that originate from Greenwood to the west of where you're talking about. So the drainage area is built into this model. What we're fine tuning is based on your feedback, and in the plan development stage, is there an opportunity to maybe put that water in a pipe and tie it into that trunk line so that it's not overland, flow down to your properties. Right. That's what we're trying logistically to figure out now, because as Rich mentioned, we've also, we've looked at the water in the roadway, dumping that into the pond before it ever hits the bypass system. And that's what Alex talked about last week. And then Rich talked about, we actually seen the reverse effect of what we wanted. So we've got to be mindful of that with this water too. But I've charged our team with looking at, could we keep that in a pipe into that trunk line system? We've also looked at, could it be redirected? Could it be redirected to the north without bearing in mind what we talked about on the very first slide? We can't do anything that would help you, that would double the problem for somebody. So that's what we're right. 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 And well, and as talking, some of those slides that were hard to read that showed the green and red numbers, this model takes into account that 100-year storm. The solution E was developed understanding this is the entire drainage area with the goal of, not having any structural flooding at 100 years. So the model accounts for that big rain event. But specifically to your point about Greenwood, that's where on the plan development side, we're trying to look at how to treat that. How do we keep it in a pipe so that it's not overland flowing, into that inlet that you're talking about? And Mr. Snyder has also sent us video. So I know exactly what you're talking about. And we'll have to work with that property owner, that's to be able to do something a little bit different with that. We're going to have to work with them to secure easements. All right. Other questions, concerns, thoughts? I assure you, every bit of feedback you give us, we're leaving no stone unturned. We're too far along in this effort to, not get the overall solution right. So I assure you, everything you say, we're hearing you. We're trying to get it incorporated the best we can into this plan.
Yes, sir. I'm Randy Mayfield, and I live at 602 Ridge Street, just second house south of Emory. And one of the things that I'm wondering about is when is all this going to be shovel ready? I mean, when are we looking to start?
Taylor, when is plans going to be ready? When are we going to have for phase one?
Yeah, we're at 60% set. So there's actually construction drawings prepared for the stuff up in the cemetery. We're talking potentially weeks.
Yeah,
plans are ready to where they could actually go get contracts.
and keeping them. And the other sort of, unfortunately, with government, where things move slower because they move slower. We're bound, if a project exceeds $100,000 in value, which that cemetery work will definitely exceed 100,000. We're required to advertise that for bids for 30 days. So as soon as the plans are ready, we put a request for bids to do that, perform that work. We're required by the state law to advertise for 30 days. I've already asked our team to start preparing to do the design on the second two phases. We had that conversation last week. Now that this first phase of design is coming to a close. And so that's when we'll begin to really sit down with you individually, call you to maybe come to City Hall, or we'll come to your house to show you the actual plans and and secure those easements. One thing, I know we've got some folks from Valley Drive. I think we probably didn't do a good enough job talking about Valley. So let's go back to solution E. That just occurred to me. Some of that drainage channel is piped, some is not piped. And so scenario E takes into consideration there, just that slide, there we go. So basically from Franklin Street to McCarty subdivision, there may be one or two segments of property that's piped. There was a gentleman here that lives in that block last week, and he brought pictures to show how bad it's scoured out, how deep, how what we call incising, how deep the creek has eroded and how wide. And he talked about how he's lost 4 feet of property. So what we're talking about doing here, other than just lining the pipe that's at 705, I believe, Valley, yeah, 705. We're going to do what we call channel protection with big rocks, what we call type 1 riprap. They used to call it 2-man riprap because it'd take 2 men to carry 1 stone, and do that along both sides of that creek. So that will stop the degradation of the stream. So I wanted just to at least talk about that a little bit further because I know you all were here. But the neat thing about this solution, as we get down back to Franklin, that red line represents a new pipe system all the way down, and the yellow line represents the existing drainage pipe. Both will be retained. So not only will this pipe system be flowing the water, it'll actually be providing some in-ground storage that's not there today. I think that's a 42-inch pipe that will be sort of allowed to inundate with water to provide some relief to that existing network that discharges at the intersection, which is sorely needed. So thank you for your patience as we talk about that a little bit more.
So you were talking about putting that rock in the stream behind there, and that yellow line there, that's the existing pipe that runs through there.
So the yellow line that runs east and west is the existing pipe. It all dumps out at the apartment complex there at Franklin Street, and then it's an open channel all the way to 705 Valley where it's piped, and then it's open channel, I believe, the rest of the way to Walnut. And so it would be all of those sections that are not piped would receive that treatment. And that's our standard treatment, you know, anywhere, even in city right away. It's just a good method to stop the loss of property. Any other question?
We talk about challenges. That's going to require easements. So, you know, one thing that y'all can do is talk about the project and help with buy-in. You know, when we get to that easement phase, you know, just help with helping people understand what the plan is and that, you know, this is for their benefit.
And one other, before we leave that point, the gentleman last week also mentioned there's a lot of trees that the roots you can see have been undermined. And so we're going to try to, as part of that work, and maybe even on phase 1, removal of some of those trees that may be leaning or ready to fall over.
I just wanted to follow up to David's comments about the water from Greenwood coming across. This is something that we've addressed with Public Works in the city for years now. And for years, we've been told it will be addressed. It's going to be a part of this. But nowhere from phase 1, starting in the cemetery, all the way through scenario E, is it addressed at all. That's my biggest concern. I mean, David's property is eroding. Our property is eroding. I mean, it's a river that comes down from there. And you know, I've got drawings from before where some of that stuff was marked on Greenwood. Nowhere now is it marked anywhere on Greenwood to be addressed. That's my biggest concern. I think the whole project from the cemetery through E is perfect. I think it needs to be done, but that Greenwood water has to be included in it on the front end.
Mr. Snyder, I mean, let me just say this. From the goals of the project, that's a detail. You know, if our goal is to, if our goal is to stop your house from flooding, what we're talking about, the water coming in, it's not causing flooding to anybody's home. that's something you address during design, the actual construction plans. That's not something we model, from a flood reduction standpoint as far as structural flooding. So again, I don't want to mislead you and say that, we're not looking at it, because we are. I mean, I had Taylor running profiles last week or the week before, kind of looking at what are the options there and kind of starting to think about a strategy of, we can potentially go down Greenwood and go around. I don't know if it's super feasible. We just got the data from the USGS for the model, so he can run those profiles and see how deep those pipes would have to be. And then the other thing that, that's some of the biggest details are going to be getting easements. We got to tear up your neighbor's yard, quite frankly, to put that pipe in. And we're going to have to go talk to them about that as well. So, that's where you're going to have to come in as well and help them understand what the problem is trying to be solved and convince them that it's a good thing to go through and start taking out trees and on their property to address that flow of water across the ground. So that'd probably be the best place, because it's a natural, kind of dam, if you will, so that we can grab it.
And just make sure what we're saying tonight is that that's a detail that we're going to address in the construction plans. I don't want you to be concerned that because you don't see it, these are the broad strokes to say what will solve this. This scenario E, I don't remember this term from economics, but I guess it's macroscopic versus microscopic. We get into microscopic issues on the plan development side. So I'm on record tonight assuring you that we're going to try to figure out how bestly to handle that, whether that's to pipe it down to that trunk line so that it's not gushing over, into the inlet, or as Rich said, we're even looking at, could we, defer that water to the north into this basin without seeing what we saw on those graphs where it actually worked against our favor. Because we talked about this a little bit more last week than we'd had this week, but Alex explained that timing in these rain events is so key, and where water is, a lot of this early water we've got to get quickly flushed out so that the system can recover and allow this detention pond in the cemetery to do its job of slowly releasing the water over a period of time. That's why that initial plan of trying to dump everything in the cemetery kind of worked against us, because we lost the benefit of flushing that water early where it's staying in the pipes and not causing a problem. And it fills up our detention pond, that storage we so valuably need to release over a longer amount of time. So I assure you on the construction plans, as we're going to start doing that, we're going to handle those details at that point. The big thing I want to get, I want to celebrate the day when we get this pond done, we get these pipes lined, folks that are having issues with their property in terms of, pipes collapsing and falling out and wash down streams, sinkholes. We can all kind of take a deep breath and then push hard again on, these next two phases. Potential. Yes, sir. Potentially. That's one of the two options we're looking at. Either that, or as I said, if the model, we're going to test those scenarios in the model. If it does just as good, the cheaper and easier thing to do, potentially, assuming, the property owner is okay, then we can work with them, is to maybe just tie it into the system and let it flush into the system where you never see the water. It stays in a pipe. And that's the challenge. And that's why we've got these experts that, I tell you, this is sometimes, unfortunately, in this stormwater, it's not common sense doesn't always prevail, because we'll come up with an idea and we'll say, hey, put this in the model, tell us if this works or doesn't work, makes it better or worse. And sometimes I'm an engineer. I mean, that's my background, and I'm even surprised about, what they tell me. And that's why we wanted these guys that do this day in and day out. Alex is, I wish he could be here. No offense to Rich, but he is just a world-renowned modeler. And thank goodness today, that's the good thing about 21st century. 10 or 15 years ago, they would be doing a lot of these calculations by hand, but some of the smartest people in the world have developed this baseline software for folks to use. And so we know, and the great thing is those 2 rain events that Rich talked about, we were able to validate our model by the what you guys were seeing. So we were getting feedback real time during that April 2020 event, March 2021, I believe. And the modeler could go in and actually, if you were telling us we saw water to this point, you sent us a picture, they could go in and actually say, is that what our model is telling us happened, or do we need to calibrate the model? And most of the time, the report I would get back from the modeler was that, hey, it's dead on. This is exactly what our model says it would do in a 3.5-inch rain that occurred over 12 hours or whatever. So
I know, to kind of take that down to a little more granular level, and it's just a real world example is Steve over there, what he told us. So whenever we come out of your property, we're listening to you because we're looking for clues. More times than not, you guys will say something you don't even know you said it, and we're like, that was critical. So one of the things that Steve told us was when he sees water come down onto his property, he'll see a big flush of water and it's gray. It's kind of clearish, grayish water. And he said, no, a little while later, it'll come down and it's reddish brown, like it's had mud in it. And so when Alex did the initial modeling, I said, Alex, I need to see at his property what's going on hydraulically. And what he's seeing is 2 bumps. He's seeing a big flush of water coming off the roadway. And then a little bit later, he's seeing another big bump. So it spikes, comes down, spikes again. It lined up exactly with what he was saying. So whenever we do these models, and I really can't emphasize how much what Alex does is not easy. It is very complex modeling. But he was able to look at that model that he designed, and then he used Steve's observations to validate that model. And he says, that's exactly what I'm seeing. I'm seeing water coming off of this basin, comes down through the property, it starts to recede, and then all the water from the cemetery catches up and goes through again. And the color differentiation is what told us that that's what was happening. We were seeing that in the model. So whenever you guys talk, we are listening, because we're looking for those validation points to say, okay, like you guys could say, it got this high on the side of the wall. Those are kind of things that we're looking for, so that when we run that model, say, how high did it get when we ran the rainfall from that storm event? Well, it got up to right here. Well, that's within an inch of what they said. So that's how we know we can make sound decisions on these scenarios.
And in the model, I know that's sometimes a hard concept to understand, but this was all based on, if you'll remember back in the summer, I believe, of last year, you probably all got a letter saying we're sending a survey party through your property to get, this is survey grade data. So that's the first step. That's what it took to get us to this point of being able to analyze the basin. So it's all survey grade. It's not Google Maps or anything like that. This is good sound data where they actually know that what we call the flow line elevation, the invert elevation of each pipe in this basin. All that's taken into account to really replicate what's actually happened in the field. So with that, is there any other questions? And like I said, we'll be glad to stay around as long as you may like, but we would like to conclude the meeting on YouTube if we're done here. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jorge. No questions on the internet? Okay, thanks.